The mist rose from the valley floor in slow, thick coils, obscuring the jagged rocks 500 feet below. Arthur stood at the very edge of the precipice, his boots inches from the drop. He had traveled for weeks to reach this silence, yet the noise inside his head remained deafening. 10 years of study had left his mind a cluttered attic, packed tight with contradictory scrolls. He stared into the gray expanse, trying to find a single clear pattern in the swirling vapor, but his vision blurred. Every time he attempted to isolate a thought, 3 more rushed in to replace it. The weight of a decade of rigid instruction pressed against his temples. He gripped the edge of the stone, his fingers digging into the cold, weathered surface until the skin pulled tight. He looked down again. The valley was a chaotic blur of shadow and light, refusing to be categorized or defined by the rules he had spent his life memorizing. He remained frozen, his breath hitching in the damp, thin mountain wind, trapped by the sheer volume of his own internal static. Arthur shifted his weight, feeling the heavy strap bite into his shoulder. He reached up, unbuckled the leather, and let the satchel fall. It hit the grass with a wet, dull thud that echoed against the cliff face. The bag tipped, spilling its contents across the dirt. Ink pots cracked, dark liquid soaking into the dry soil, while pages of dense, cramped script caught the wind and skittered toward the edge. He watched the diagram of the stars curl and tear as it tumbled over the precipice. He did not reach for it. He did not try to save the ink or the years of research now staining the ground. The mess lay there, a chaotic sprawl of ink and parchment that mirrored the frantic state of his own mind. He stepped away from the pile, his boots crunching on the discarded pens. The sudden lightness of his shoulders felt strange, almost wrong. He looked at the ink spreading like a dark bruise on the earth, then turned his back on it entirely. He walked toward the center of the stone circle, leaving the fragments of his old life behind in the dirt. He did not look back once, his focus shifting entirely to the empty space ahead. Arthur lowered himself into the center of the stone circle. He crossed his legs, pulled his spine straight, and closed his eyes. The silence of the mountain did not bring peace. It brought a roar. Within seconds, the voices of his old teachers flooded his mind. He heard the sharp, rhythmic cadence of their lectures, the rigid logic of their star charts, and the relentless warnings about the dangers of deviation. He tried to push the images aside, but they were persistent. A complex diagram of the celestial spheres spun behind his eyelids, its lines shifting and overlapping until the geometry became a blur. He gritted his teeth. The theories he had spent a decade mastering now felt like jagged glass, scraping against his focus. He clenched his fists, pressing his palms into his thighs. His knuckles turned white, the skin stretching taut over bone as the intensity of his internal conflict peaked. He was fighting a war against his own memory, trying to silence the very knowledge that had defined his existence. Every time he attempted to find a void, a new argument surged forward to fill it. He squeezed his hands tighter, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the mental noise reached a fever pitch. He was trapped in a cycle of intellectual rebellion, his body rigid, his mind a battlefield. Arthur forced his hands to relax, letting his fingers uncurl from his palms. He shifted his focus to the wind. It whistled through the canyon, a low, constant drone that scraped against his skin. The sun climbed to its zenith, baking the stone beneath him until the heat radiated upward, prickling his legs. He did not move. He let the sweat bead on his forehead and trail down his temple, refusing to reach up and wipe it away. He sat through the long, slow crawl of the afternoon. When the sun finally dipped, the air turned brittle. The warmth vanished, replaced by a sharp, biting chill that settled into his joints. He held his breath, keeping his chest steady. A small pebble tumbled down the slope and clicked against the stone just inches from his knee. His muscles twitched, but he pinned himself to the ground. A raven landed on the edge of the circle, its claws scraping the rock. He remained a statue, letting the world happen around him. The hours after dusk stretched into an infinite hollow void. Arthur sat in the center of the circle as the last remnants of twilight bled from the sky. The mental noise, which had been a deafening roar of theories and rules, began to fray at the edges. It did not vanish all at once. It thinned, like smoke dissipating in a gale. He felt the familiar urge to categorize the darkness, to name the constellations, but he let the impulse drift away. He watched his own mind attempt to construct a framework, and then, with a conscious effort of will, he dismantled it. The internal dialogue slowed. Sentences became fragments. Fragments became single words. Then, the words ceased entirely. A sudden, profound stillness rushed into the space. It was not an emptiness, but a clarity. He felt the weight of the mountain beneath him, and the pulse of the night air against his skin. He was no longer a scholar measuring the world against a scroll. He was simply a part of the night itself. The relief was physical. His breathing deepened, matching the slow, rhythmic cycle of the valley. He existed in the silence, fully present, watching the world without the need to define it. Arthur pushed himself upright. His joints protested, a sharp, grinding ache that rippled through his knees and lower back after the long, motionless hours. He stood, his balance wavering for a heartbeat before he found his center. The stone circle felt different now, no longer a boundary, but a point of departure. He walked toward the cliff edge, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not check his pulse or measure the wind speed. He reached the precipice and looked out. The moon was cresting the far ridge, a pale silver arc that spilled light across the valley floor. Before, this sight would have triggered a cascade of calculations. The angle of refraction, the geological age of the rock, the historical significance of the terrain. Now, those thoughts remained dormant. He saw only the light. He saw the way the silver glow clung to the jagged edges of the cliffs and pooled in the deep, dark hollows of the brush. It was a raw, unmediated reality. The valley was not a subject to be mastered or a puzzle to be solved. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, and for the first time in his life, he was seeing it without the interference of his own mind. The clarity was absolute, a clean, sharp window into the world as it truly was. Arthur reached into his side pocket and pulled out the final notebook. It was heavy, bound in worn material, and filled with years of meticulous, obsessive notes. He held it in his palm, feeling the texture of the cover against his skin. This object contained every theory he had ever cherished, every rule he had once lived by, and every doubt that had kept him awake in the dark. He looked down at the pages, but the ink seemed meaningless now, mere scratches on dead paper. The wind whipped around the cliff, tugging at the edges of the book, as if the valley itself were waiting for him to let go. He did not hesitate for long. He extended his arm over the void, the book hovering above the sheer drop. For a heartbeat, the weight of the past pulled against his fingers, a final anchor, trying to hold him to the person he used to be. He opened his hand. The book fell. It tumbled through the air, shrinking into a small, dark speck, before it vanished into the swirling mist below. There was no sound of impact, only the steady, rhythmic rush of the wind against the cliff face. He watched the spot where it had disappeared, his hand still outstretched, empty and light. The connection was broken. The theories, the arguments, and the rigid structures of his past were gone. The absence of the notebook in his hand triggered an immediate, physical reaction. The tension that had locked his shoulders and tightened his jaw for a decade simply evaporated. He took a deep breath, and for the first time, his lungs expanded without the resistance of internal doubt. He flexed his fingers, watching them move with a fluid, natural grace. The stiffness in his joints, which had plagued him since he rose from the stone circle, vanished as if the weight of his past had been a literal burden pulling his bones toward the earth. He shifted his weight, and his body responded with an effortless, rhythmic ease. He was no longer a collection of theories or a vessel for ancient, conflicting rules. He was merely a man standing on a cliff, grounded in the present. He raised his arms, feeling the cool night air brush against his skin, unobstructed and clean. The moonlight seemed to sharpen, illuminating the terrain with a clarity that matched his own internal state. Every movement he made now felt intentional, stripped of the hesitation. He turned his head, his neck moving without the familiar, grinding ache of long-held stress. He was light, he was present, and he was entirely his own. The transformation was complete, a total shedding of the identity he had spent 10 years constructing, leaving behind only the simple, undeniable reality of his own existence. Arthur turned his back on the cliff. The path ahead was dark, yet he did not stumble. He walked past the stone circle where he had spent the long hours of the day, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth. Near the edge of the clearing, he saw the ink pots and scattered parchment he had dropped hours ago. They lay in the dirt, half hidden by the tall grass, their contents long since dried and useless. He stopped for a fraction of a second, his gaze resting on the mess of his former life. He did not reach down to gather them. He did not feel the urge to organize or preserve the fragments of his old theories. He simply stepped over the debris and continued walking. The village lights flickered in the distance, small and warm against the vast, dark expanse of the valley. He moved with a steady, rhythmic gait, his arms swinging freely at his sides. The air was cool, and with every step, the silence of the night felt less like an absence and more like a companion. He did not look back at the cliff. He did not search the horizon for signs or omens. He kept his eyes fixed on the path, his head clear, his breath even. He walked forward, leaving the mountain behind, his pace unhurried and his purpose absolute. He was a man simply walking home.